As one begins to study the gospel seriously, they may come into contact with many objections from atheists or people of even other faith groups who say that the gospel amounts to nothing more than cosmic child abuse, the act of a malevolent father who's punishing his innocent son for the crimes of others. But do these arguments really stick? Questions like these, or objections like these, I believe can be broken up into two distinct parts. The first is, how can God the Father punish the innocent son on account of guilty sinners like you and me? And the second is, how can that guilt itself be transferred from a sinful human to an innocent, perfect, divine person? So to answer the first part of the objection as to how God can be just in punishing the innocent Jesus for the place of guilty sinners, I believe it's good if we start off by looking at Euthyphro's Dilemma. So Euthyphro's Dilemma is basically an account written in one of Plato's works titled Euthyphro, in which Socrates is having a conversation with a man of the same name. And in this conversation, Socrates asks, is something good? Because, well, they were living in the Greek mythological culture at that time, so he says gods. But nevertheless, he asks, is something good because the gods say it is? Or do the gods say it because it's good? So whichever side of the argument one attests for, there are serious implications for both. The first being that if one says that something is good because God says it is, they risk having a God who is just arbitrarily out in the universe deciding what's good and what's bad. What's the standard? Is it just his whimsical feelings? I mean, what's to stop him from next week saying that, murder's okay, rape is okay? There is none. On the other side of that coin, however, if God is saying to do something or not do something because that thing is good or bad respectively, then he's appealing to a standard beyond himself, meaning he has to look and see if that thing is good or bad outside of what he thinks of it. And if that's the case, and if he's not the standard, then how can he be God? So the key to answering Euthyphro's dilemma is to recognize it for what it truly is, which is that of a false dichotomy. While we are given two responses, neither of those responses can sufficiently answer the issue at hand, and so therefore we assume there must be a third, and there is. So the answer to Euthyphro's dilemma is that God himself is the standard, meaning he doesn't have to look to anything beyond himself to decide if murder is wrong or adultery is wrong. And now I know what you're thinking. He also doesn't have to arbitrarily just decide these things either, because as the standard, part of God's nature is that he's immutable, meaning he's unchanging. So therefore, we don't have to worry about what he said yesterday not matching up with what he'll say a week from now. He's the same. So what does this all have to do with cosmic justice and, child abuse that's going on with Jesus? Well, so basically, the answer to Euthyphro's dilemma actually connects very closely with that of divine command theory, which basically holds that something is good or bad if God says it is. Now, again, this does not mean that God is just whimsically deciding what those things are, because the one demand of divine command theory is that God is consistent with his own nature. So going forward, one could argue then, and actually can see in divine command theory, as well as the answer to Euthyphro's dilemma, that since God has no moral law hanging over himself, because he is the standard, God himself has no moral duties. Again, he has to act accordingly with his nature, but he himself has no moral duties, meaning there's no 10 commandments for God telling him that he needs to do these 10 things, right? Like he gives to us, because he's objective and we're subjective. A perfect case of this is in the example of Abraham and Isaac. Right? If Abraham, never hearing a command of God, would have just randomly decided to kill Isaac one day, most certainly would have been murder. But God himself demanding that Abraham sacrifice Isaac, there's nothing immoral about that. Is it a difficult thing to do? Absolutely. But God himself being that standard, being in accordance with his nature, he has the absolute right to demand and take life as he sees fit. So one could argue that since God doesn't have an external law hanging above his head, he can't be deemed immoral or unjust for choosing to sacrifice Jesus. However, some could raise the objection that since they believe retributive justice is part of God's nature, that for him to actually do that and sacrifice Jesus would be going against his nature, therefore violating divine command theory. Now, as someone who actually does believe retributive justice is part of God's nature, I would agree with them. And so I think we have to go a step further in addressing the issue. So in order to do that, first we have to ask ourselves, what is retributive justice? Well, there are two kinds. You have positive and negative. Positive retributive justice states that the guilty should be punished because they deserve it, while negative retributive justice states that the innocent should not be punished because they don't deserve it. God in the Bible most certainly claims to be a positive retributivist. However, one could argue that God actually is not fully negative retributivist. Why? Well, because while God does claim to be fully positive retributivist by always punishing the guilty, when it comes to negative retributive justice, while he may give commands to humans to not punish the innocent, while he himself may not punish innocent humans, There's nothing within that that says he can't punish innocent divine persons, aka Christ. Why does this matter? Because the only divine person that would exist would essentially be God, meaning this issue would just circle directly back to him and bring us right back to divine command theory. Because if this individual is God, then they themselves also are not subject to that moral law. Now here your ears might perk up a bit and you might be thinking, well, wait, I thought Jesus came to fulfill the law, and now you're telling me he's not under it? Absolutely, I agree, he came to fulfill the law. But when I speak of Christ not being under the law, I'm speaking about him in his divine spiritual sense, the pre-incarnate Christ, the Son who was co-equal and co-eternal with the Father before he ever took on human skin. The Trinity, the Godhead, they were never under an external law because, as I said, God himself is the standard. However, God in that pre-incarnate form could not be the sacrifice because he's eternal. How can an eternal person die? This is exactly why he had to take on human skin, live the sinless life that we couldn't live. Although he was already sinless in his pre-incarnate form, now he just took it and transferred it to the human life as well. And so now he can be that sacrifice. So again, what I'm essentially saying here is that if, according to divine command theory, God has no higher standard than himself when it comes to moral obligations, he is the goodness, right? Then when it comes to the dealings between the Father and the Son, two persons of the Godhead who have no moral duties or laws hanging above them, who's to say that the Father and the Son can't mutually agree that the Father will sacrifice the Son for the sake of saving mankind? Remember, the only prerequisite is that whatever these two do, it has to be consistent with their nature. And what could be more consistent with God's nature than this public display of his love, mercy, and seriousness about sin than by sacrificing himself essentially for the sake of us? But again, even if you wanted to go even farther, right? If I'm playing devil's advocate here, I could say, well, no, what if negative retributive justice is essential to God's nature so that he won't even do it to himself? Now, again, I think it's a pretty sound objection, right? And so to that, I would say that according to the doctrine of penal substitution, Christ himself is guilty. So therefore, God the Father is not unjust in punishing Christ. Now, before you start writing your crazy mad comments about how you're going to unsubscribe and how I'm promoting heresy, let me just tell you what I'm not saying first, okay? I'm not saying that Christ ever broke the law. I'm not saying that Christ ever sinned. And I'm not saying that Christ deserved to die on the cross. What I am saying is that Christ, as our representative, should we choose to accept him, willingly bore the guilt that we should have bore ourselves because of his love and mercy for us. Therefore, standing before that judge as if he were guilty. Did he himself commit any wrongdoings? No. But because of that relationship, he's choosing to have the punishment and the guilt for that taken upon himself in what is known as vicarious liability. Before getting to vicarious liability, though, I do want to point out something in regards to imputation, which is basically the belief that Christ bore the guilt of our sin. And it's that our sin was not transferred to Christ, and that my sin left me, and Christ took my sin, and now I'm innocent. Because think about it. I know a lot of people believe this too, but if you really stop and think about it, it makes no sense. If Christ already took all of mankind's sin from them at the cross, then what would there be to accept? It's already been done. When I die, that's universalism, essentially. When I die, all of us, when we all die, we're going to heaven because Christ already took all of our sin. There's nothing to accept or reject. It's a done deal. And obviously, we know that's not biblical. I believe the more sound argument is to hold that our sin was replicated in Christ. And this isn't a doctrine that's foreign to the Bible, right? When you look at original sin, Adam himself sinned, right? But when he had children and they had children and they had children, they also had a sin nature. Now, was Adam's sin nature transferred from him to others in which the sin left him and he was no longer guilty before God? No, of course not. Instead, it was replicated. And that's exactly how it applies here as well, with Christ boring our sin. And so that now brings us to the concept of vicarious liability, which is essentially one that holds that an innocent party can be punished for the acts of a guilty party because of the two's connection. The most common sphere in which we see this has to do with employer and employee relationships. If an employee does something negligent while on the job and causes a customer to be hurt or injured or even die, the actual company itself can be held accountable, the employer. Ironically enough, vicarious liability is actually sometimes referred to as imputed liability. Even as many of you are watching, I'm sure you can think of your own examples in regard to this. When I was researching online, I saw that this is a huge thing in like the medical field, and how, if a nurse or some practitioner messes up something, the hospital itself can be deemed responsible. You see this as well with companies like FedEx, who have drivers who are out on the job. And if they do something that causes damages within their scope of employment, FedEx will be held responsible. And it makes sense, right? If they do that, why are you going to go after the individual person when they're under the representation of the company? You can also see examples of this in criminal law as well. There was a case named like V Whitehead, where a manager who had been told not to allow prostitutes to work within the place of business ultimately allowed them. And when it came to light, the employer himself was held responsible. Again, we're not saying that the employer was liable or even negligent, but it was just merely the fact that the guilt was imputed from the employee to the employer because of the two's relationship. Right, and so when we accept Christ, he essentially becomes our representative in a sense, right? Our employer. Meaning when we're in that courtroom, we are the employee, we have committed the crime, but because of his desire to have that relationship with us, he's willing to face that judge, who is the Father, and bear the burden for our guilt for the sake of preserving that relationship. All right, now finally, someone may still try and contest that the actual act of imputing liability to the employer is still unjust, but it's the only reasonable thing we can do, because trying to prosecute every individual person rather than their representative would just be merely impossible. When looking at this at face value, it may seem as such, but when looking beneath the surface, I don't even really think this holds. Right? I'd get it if it were just some random person, but if we have a representative for ourselves who's willing to voluntarily take the cost, whatever it may be, I don't see anything wrong with that. Now, if it were involuntary or involuntary, and the employer was forced to pay for this employee when they didn't want to, and the employee, got off scot-free, then yeah, I could see that. But this isn't a random person. It's a closely knit representative who has a deep care for the employee, and it's voluntary. So I don't see any issue with what's going on. So just to finish off that analogy now, if we're in that courtroom with that employer that we've, freely accepted to be our representative, if he pays that fine, if he takes that punishment, then in the eyes of the law, we are no longer under the conviction, under the condemnation of it. We can walk off scot-free. Now, again, everyone in that courtroom knows that we were the ones who did the action, while the employer was essentially sinless, right? But ultimately, what matters is that he bore the brunt of the guilt that should have been due to us, that we should have had to face the punishment for. But remember that we have to accept the representation. If we do, then great, because we get the pardon that comes along with that, since our employer, our representative, aka Christ, took the punishment. He paid the fine. But if we reject the representative, all right, then we don't get the pardon and we still stand convicted before the law. So while at the end of the day, arguments against the gospel as being some form of cosmic child abuse are certainly emotional and vehement, they aren't almost ever intellectually strong. But the bottom line is that I hope these people who are raising these objections will ultimately come to know Christ as their representative, as their employer, and as their savior. Because without him, they'll have to stand in the face of that law, which convicts them. And in the face of that law, they'll have no hope. They'll have no assurance. And so I just pray for them. I pray for anyone who may be kind of struggling with this. And I just pray that God will open their eyes, and that they'll see the truth of this matter and rejoice that, God loved us enough to do this for us. And so yeah. Anyways, guys, that's the video. Look, this was supposed to be a super simple video, but I just dove so deep into the topic, it's so intricate and nuanced and detailed. The last 2 days, it's all I've been focused on. I was even almost late to class a few times because I was just reading so much, right? But I hope I've done a decent job of just explaining this clearly to all of you. And if there's anything you were still having trouble with, by all means, let me know. Shoot me an email, comment, let me know what you think. I want to hear your thoughts. I want to have a discussion, and share this with people who you may know have this objection, or who know others who have this objection, right? Because the point is to equip the church and to love God with our minds, right? Love God with our heart, soul, strength, and minds. And so that's really the key here. So please like, share, subscribe, and please get the word out about this channel, because you guys are pioneers, and I thank you for the work that you have been doing. Thank you. Oh, and by the way, I got to give a really big shout out to William Lane Craig and his team over at Reasonable Faith. Almost all of the points I made in this video were extracted from articles that he had written about, and just, all these points that this man's a genius. Okay. So I'm going to be linking to his articles in the description if you want to read in much, much further detail. He's the man for the job. All right. But yeah, I want to thank him and his team for the work that they've been doing. They have bolstered me so much intellectually in my faith, and I can never be grateful enough for that. So yeah, thank you guys.